I had it all, an empire, a family, an ideal, until the day they held my funeral, while I was still alive. Ridgeview Church loomed in the gray light of an early March morning, its stone walls absorbing the quiet hum of whispers and restrained sobs. Outside reporters and camera crews were corralled behind black iron gates, their lenses craning like vultures. Inside, the air was still too still. Manufactured grief floated beneath stained glass windows that had seen more truth and light than the people now seated in their pews. A black-clad man entered through the side door. No one turned. He moved like a shadow unnoticed among ushers and attendants. His hat brim cast a low shade over a face that bore scars of something deeper than injury betrayal. Thomas Walker. He paused at the back of the church watching them. At the altar stood Brandon Walker, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, voice quivering just enough to convince. My father was a man of vision, of drive, of legacy. He sniffed, letting a tear glisten under the light. He built something out of nothing, and now it's our duty to carry that forward. Thomas felt the bile rise in his throat. The same son who stood beside his hospital bed 2 weeks ago, eyes dry, and heart colder than the monitors around him, was now shedding designer sorrow. And then there was Vanessa, sitting 2 rows behind, one hand squeezing a black clutch, the other scrolling on her phone. He looked at the altar, the casket closed, polished untouched, and there, placed carefully atop the lid, was the silver pocket watch. His father's, the hands frozen at 1413. He remembered that moment with clarity no accident could erase. The brakes failing, the spin, the cold steel of the guardrail, and then darkness. Thomas moved forward past pews filled with executives pretending sadness and relatives counting their inheritance. He knelt beside the casket under the guise of rearranging a wreath and with deft fingers retrieved the pocket watch. No one noticed. No one wanted to notice. He slipped through the hallway away from stage grief. That's where he saw her, Vanessa. Alone on a call, pacing with a legal pad in one hand and venom in her voice. Yes, I have power of attorney. Brandon signed it. Once probate clears, we can move the signing rights. No, there's no resistance. The old man's dead. Thomas halted. She passed inches from him, never registering the face behind the funeral attendant's disguise. Her scent, her sharp tone, her control, it was all rehearsed. Efficient, ruthless. In a room adjacent to the main hall, Thomas found Brandon's coat slung carelessly over a chair. He pulled out a folded note and tucked it into the inside pocket. In bold ink, the dead will demand justice. He stepped back into the shadows, slipping behind curtains, as the closing hymn began. The pastor lifted the Bible, hands trembling more than they had earlier in the service. Thomas stepped into the center aisle. At first, no one reacted. Then someone gasped. The pastor's voice caught mid-verse, and the Bible fell to the floor with a thud. Brandon turned, his face drained of color. What the hell? Thomas met his eyes. I came to see who was crying about what real loss or opportunity to seize. Gasps echoed. Murmurs spread. A woman fainted in the third row. Vanessa turned slowly, eyes narrowing. You said he's dead. So, who's standing there? Thomas stepped forward, calm, measured. He looked directly at the coffin. I'm not dead yet, but my empire is almost buried alive with that empty coffin. I returned to the office after 3 weeks of absence. On the table was a signed contract in my name, in my handwriting, but not in my hand. Walker Holdings towered above the city like a monument to ambition, gleaming glass steel angles, and a name etched in marble across the revolving doors. Thomas had once stood proudly at its apex. Now he entered like a ghost. No one greeted him. No one screamed. The security guard merely nodded, unsure whether he was seeing a legend or a scandal walking upright. The lobby was sleek as always, but something about it felt colder, emptier. The curated art on the walls, the polite jazz from the ceiling speakers, it was all as he remembered, yet stripped of warmth. A building can wear silence like a suit. He took the private elevator, the one that required a thumbprint he no longer offered. When the doors opened to the executive floor, it was Brandon's voice he heard echoing from behind his old office door. We'll finalize by Friday. No delays, his son said, firm, self-important. Thomas waited until the office cleared. Then he entered. The room had changed. His antique desk was gone, replaced by a sleek, minimalist slab. His framed photographs, his wife, the launch of the IPO, even Brandon's high school graduation were nowhere to be seen. In their place, a sculpture of twisted steel and a painting he didn't recognize, branding the new regime. But what chilled him more was the stack of contracts on the desk. He lifted one. His name was there, his signature too. April the 2nd. His hands froze. That was 12 days after the crash. Another file. April 5th. A transfer of voting shares. His signature again. The pen strokes matched his exactly. He flipped page after page each contract, authorizing different transactions, some involving millions in liquid assets, others transferring control over regional branches. All legally binding, all signed by him. He backed away, heart steady but eyes darkening. "Good morning, Mr. Walker." He turned. Sarah Monroe stood at the door folder, in hand lips pressed into a cautious smile. "You're not surprised to see me," he said. "I was hoping I'd be the first to say welcome back." Privately, he closed the door. "Talk." She handed him the folder. "I've been gathering these since the day of your funeral." Inside printouts, screenshots, flagged messages. One was a death certificate. Cause cardiac arrest. Date of death March 9th, 2024. Signed by Dr. Mason Geller. "He's been unreachable," Sarah said. "The numbers disconnected. Office cleared out." Thomas stared at the certificate. "And the IRS. They received this, with Vanessa's legal authorization to update the company's beneficiary and executor documents." He sat down, pocket watch in hand, feeling the weight of its silence. "They signed for me," he muttered. "In life. In death." Sarah glanced toward the hallway. Vanessa's careful but arrogant. She assumes no one's watching anymore. "I have access to the internal server. There's something you should see." They moved quickly to a vacant meeting room. Sarah inserted a flash drive. An email opened on the screen. Subject: leadership transition announcement from Vanessa Walker to all shareholders. "We mourn the sudden loss of Mr. Thomas Walker, a titan of industry. Brandon Walker will serve as interim CEO as per the emergency succession protocol." "She sent this 2 days after your accident," Sarah said. "No hospital record. Just this." Thomas's gaze sharpened. Another folder sat beside the email labeled TW Protocol. Emergency transfer. He clicked it. A password prompt. Sarah whispered, "It's encrypted," but the file name alone. Thomas pulled a drive from his pocket and copied the file. This wasn't just fraud. This was orchestration. Meticulous. Calculated. 2 years, he thought. They didn't act out of panic. They planned this. He stood scanning the room as if the walls might start whispering, "If they dare fake my death, I start to wonder, was I ever really their father?" No one knew that the first person to visit me in the hospital was the person I had fired. The bell above the door jingled as Thomas stepped into the quiet coffee shop. It was tucked behind a dry cleaner and a shuttered bookstore in the suburbs, exactly the kind of place you went to be unseen. The barista gave him a polite nod, but no second glance. That's how Thomas wanted it. In the corner booth, a man in a charcoal coat stirred a black coffee without drinking it. Kyle Brennan hadn't changed much, same sharp jawline, same eyes that never blinked when delivering bad news. He looked up, then back down. Thomas slid into the booth. "You look like a man waiting for a confession." "I'm more interested in evidence," Kyle said. Thomas nodded. "You're the one on the hallway. Camera, aren't you?" Kyle reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I was passing by the night of your surgery. The hospital had already signed off your death by the time I arrived, which was strange considering your heart was still beating." He handed over a printed email header intact. Subject: Operation Succession. Finalization timeline from bwalker@walkerholdings.com to bwalker@walkerholdings.com, confirming that the death certificate will be processed by Dr. Edgar Morrow, licensed in Florida, not practicing here. Clean history. Ensure the certificate is scanned to the IRS and state agencies before April 1st. Thomas read it twice, then a third time. They used an out-of-state doctor. "Clever," he muttered. "Illegal," Kyle corrected. "Which is why you need more than a confrontation. You need leverage." Thomas leaned back, the memory of Kyle's resignation surfacing. Brandon had cornered him in front of the entire advisory board, accusing him of overstepping on asset protection clauses. Vanessa had smiled the whole time, polite and venomous. "I thought you disappeared," Thomas said. "I was made to," Kyle replied. "But I didn't leave empty-handed." He placed a second folder on the table, thinner than the first but heavier in implication. Inside, a draft of a document titled Emergency Power of Attorney, TW Provisional. The signatures were placeholders, the language murky. This document was never notarized. It only activates under confirmed death. "Which last I checked," Thomas raised an eyebrow. "I'm breathing." Kyle slid his phone across the table. On the screen, an audio file. "She hired him," Brandon, Vanessa's voice said. "From Florida. He doesn't even live here. But his record's clean. No one's going to question it." Brandon's voice answered low and jittery. "As long as no one ever digs." Thomas pushed the phone back slowly. "You recorded them. Old habits die hard." The two men sat in silence for a long minute. "I want them to confess," Thomas said. "I want them to unravel themselves." Kyle smirked. "That can be arranged." They moved to the alley behind the shop. Kyle handed him a USB stick. Encrypted. Full chain of emails. Every plan they made. Thomas pocketed it. "And the doctor?" he asked. "Already flagged." "I've filed a quiet complaint to the medical board." "No names attached yet." Thomas nodded. "I'm staging a phone call from the bank, asking Brandon to re-verify signature patterns. With you feeding the script." Kyle understood immediately. "You want him nervous. I want him sloppy." As they shook hands, Kyle paused. "You never asked why I came to the hospital." Thomas tilted his head. "I knew they'd make a move," Kyle said. "But I also knew you weren't the kind of man who dies without a fight." Thomas smiled faintly. "I don't need to scream for justice. I just need them to fear my shadow long enough to tell it all themselves. I don't need a gun, I just need a smart question asked at the right meeting." The executive boardroom at Walker Holdings was designed to intimidate: long mahogany table chrome accents, 12 chairs for the voting members, and a panoramic window that turned the skyline into a silent audience. This was where deals were born, empires expanded, and today masks would crack. Brandon adjusted his cufflinks at the head of the table, dressed in a navy suit too crisp, too deliberate. To his right, Vanessa flipped through a stack of legal folders like a maestro preparing a finale. To the rest of the board, it was just another quarterly update. They had no idea a ghost was listening. In a nearby server room, Sarah Monroe monitored the encrypted feed. The hidden pin camera embedded in a decorative light fixture was feeding everything live to Thomas. He sat miles away alone, eyes fixed on his laptop screen, expression unreadable. Kyle Brennan stood behind him, arms crossed. "Ready?" he asked. Thomas didn't blink. Let's see if he's foolish enough to crown himself with a stolen crown. In the boardroom, Brandon tapped the table. "Before we begin the financials," he said, "I have an important announcement." Vanessa nodded toward the head of legal, who placed a document on the central monitor. "I would like to formally assume the role of Chief Executive Officer," Brandon continued. "Under the authority granted by the Emergency Succession Protocol, and with the full backing of the board." The directors murmured. Some nodded. Others glanced at each other. But Brandon added quickly for transparency, "I have brought a copy of the signed authorization, the document that validates the transfer." He motioned to the screen. A PDF file opened. Vanessa froze. It wasn't the one she had prepared. The signature was there, but the notary stamp was missing. In the server room, Sarah grinned. Thomas leaned forward, hands steepled. In the boardroom, an older member raised his hand. "Mr. Alcott, semi-retired, loyal to the founding values." "I would like to see the original," he said, voice even, with Mr. Walker's handwriting, "and the notarization." Brandon blinked. "Of course. This copy must be an outdated version." Another director frowned. "Why is there no timestamp?" "The metadata says April 2nd, but that's after Mr. Walker's death announcement." Vanessa's mouth thinned. She began typing rapidly on her tablet. Then ping. Every phone in the room vibrated at once. The directors reached for their devices. Subject: legal breach notification. Death cannot precede signature message. Dead people cannot sign contracts. Attached scanned death certificate dated March 9th. Contract dated April 2nd. Do the math. Brandon's face drained of color. He turned to Vanessa, whispering, "What the hell is this?" Before she could respond, the door opened. Kyle Brennan stepped in calm as a lawyer at a bar exam. Several directors stirred in recognition. Brandon stood. "This is a private meeting I was invited," Kyle said, producing a legal envelope. "By one of your shareholders. My assessment is based on public corporate filings and internal documents." He placed a binder on the table, opening it to a single page. "The emergency succession protocol is invalid. The power of attorney was activated posthumously based on a falsified death certificate. That renders any contract executed under that authority null and void." A director cleared his throat. "Are you saying the company has no legal CEO?" Kyle turned. "Unless Thomas Walker is dead, which I believe some of you already doubt. You've all been manipulated." Vanessa stood, speaking for the first time. "This is slander." "It's documentation," Kyle said, tapping the binder. Sarah sent one last file and audio snippet to the board members. Vanessa's voice unmistakable. "He doesn't even live here, but his record's clean. No one's going to question it." Kyle closed his folder. "If the board doesn't react, I will release the entire death certificate forgery to the press and see how far your stock falls overnight." Silence. Brandon sat down slowly, eyes blank. Thomas leaned back in his chair, staring at the paused video feed, as if weighing the silence itself. "They brought this on themselves," he said, "and in the boardroom the real reckoning had only begun. I never thought I'd get congratulations at my own memorial." The Weston Memorial Funeral Home was draped in white lilies and manufactured grief. A string quartet played in the background, and a large digital screen looped photos of Thomas Walker, smiling at conferences, cutting ribbons, shaking hands. Underneath it all, the caption, "A Legacy Remembered." Vanessa stood center stage, dressed in elegant mourning black, her tone restrained but confident. "Even though my father is gone, we will continue to honor his vision. Walker Holdings will not just survive, it will ascend." The audience, investors, ex-board members, family friends, media crews nodded along. A few sniffled. Cameras were angled carefully to avoid the empty casket. Outside, a storm of flashbulbs lit up the gates. Inside, everything was calculated, controlled. Until Thomas Walker opened the side door and walked in. No fanfare, no thunderclap. Just the sound of dress shoes on marble and the slow turning of heads one by one. Vanessa froze mid-sentence. Brandon stood near the back, flanked by a lawyer, his phone vibrating endlessly in his pocket. He hadn't yet read the latest memo from the bank. Thomas walked slowly down the center aisle. Some gasped, others whispered. A woman clutched her pearls. A junior journalist dropped her camera. Vanessa's voice cracked. "This is impossible." Thomas reached the podium and turned to face the crowd. "I wasn't invited," he said calmly, "but I heard someone planned a party in my name. Thought it rude not to show up." Dead silence. He placed two documents on the podium, holding them up. "In my hand is a death certificate filed under my name, dated March 9th. And here," he raised the second sheet, an email sent by Vanessa Pierce to Weston Trust Bank, requesting a full liquidation of the Walker inheritance, citing my confirmed death. He stepped back. A wave of murmuring spread like ripples across the room. Reporters unzipped bags. Lenses clicked. Flashbulbs ignited. Vanessa's smile was frozen now, brittle. Brandon mouthed something, but his voice didn't find air. Thomas glanced at him. "You might want to check your bank app. As of 3 hours ago, all accounts tied to the trust were frozen under court order." A man in a gray suit stood up. It was Gerald Huang, a major investor. "Mr. Walker, what is happening?" Thomas took a breath. "A year ago, I would have handled this quietly, behind closed doors. But not now." He faced the crowd directly. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because people like these," he gestured toward Vanessa and Brandon, "believe they can rewrite truth signatures, even bloodlines, with enough legal jargon and well-timed lies." He paused, letting the weight settle. "I will take them to court, not just for what they did to me, but to make sure they never do it to someone else." Camera flashes erupted. Voices called out, "Mr. Walker, what charges? How long have you known? Did your son really fake your death?" Thomas turned back to the screen behind him, where his own obituary looped in silence. He smiled just a little. "And if any of you still believe I'm dead, Please come with them to court. Vanessa grabbed Brandon's arm, whispering furiously. Too late. Sarah Monroe, hidden near the back, sent a final email from her phone copies of all forged documents, time-stamped attached sent to the board, the media, and the Federal Fraud Bureau. Outside, the press vans lit up their broadcasts. Inside, no one was crying anymore. I was written off. But this time, I'm living as myself, not the role they assigned me. The seal of the New York Supreme Court loomed over the oak-paneled room. The murmur of journalists behind the glass gallery quieted as the judge entered. Brandon sat in the defendant's chair, no longer in tailored suits but in a basic gray blazer. Vanessa, poised as ever, wore black, her chin high, even as the prosecution outlined the digital trail of fraud. Thomas sat calmly, not in the plaintiff's box, but in the second row. He didn't look at them. Not once. The prosecution's voice was clear. Bank transfers signed under false pretenses, a fabricated death certificate, manipulation of shareholders via falsified communication, all orchestrated under Operation Succession. The central figure, Vanessa Pierce. Evidence was projected on-screen: timestamps, email headers, deposit records, all bearing Thomas's forged signature. Vanessa didn't flinch until Kyle Brennan, now a witness, presented the original unedited legal document she had attempted to destroy. A ripple moved through the courtroom. Sarah Monroe had delivered the final blow, hours before an encrypted file sent directly to the SEC and 3 global financial partners. It detailed the web of shell companies Vanessa used to siphon money out of Walker Holdings' European branches. When the verdict came, the room was silent. Vanessa Pierce is sentenced to 9 years in federal prison for fraud, document forgery, and conspiracy to defraud financial institutions. Brandon Walker is barred from holding executive roles in any publicly traded company for the next 10 years. The judge paused. Let this case serve as a warning not just to those who commit financial crimes, but to those who enable them through silence. Thomas exhaled slowly, not in victory, in closure. Outside, the courthouse steps were awash in cameras. This time, Thomas stepped forward willingly. I won't return as CEO, he said into the microphones. When power becomes personal, corruption becomes inevitable. I've built a legacy, but I refuse to be ruled by it. He held up a new emblem, a modest black and silver badge. This is the Walker Institute. Our mission is simple: protect the people who build empires from those who believe they own them. A few reporters clapped. Most scribbled furiously. 3 weeks later, Thomas returned to Walker Holdings headquarters. His office was untouched. The pocket watch lay on the desk, ticking once more. Sarah walked in. They offered me CTO, she said with a smirk. I told them I'd think about it. If you stay on the board. He chuckled. Board's too loud. I prefer whispering from the wings. She paused, then handed him a sealed envelope. Kyle asked me to give you this. It's the first grant approval for the Institute. You're now funding 10 startups run by CEOs who were ousted the way you were. He looked out the window beyond the skyline, beyond the noise. You know, he said quietly, I used to think building something meant never letting go. Now I realize it's knowing when to leave it in the right hands. He placed the pocket watch back into his jacket. As he stepped out of the office for the last time, a journalist nearby asked one final question. What would you say to the people who tried to erase you? Thomas didn't break stride. They thought they buried me. They didn't know. I was the seed. Even after the courtroom lights dimmed and the headlines faded, the echo of Thomas Walker's defiance lingered. He had been declared dead, buried by greed, erased by those he once raised. But the truth surfaced one file at a time, until justice no longer needed to shout it, simply stood undeniable. Like the final chord of a long-forgotten melody, justice may arrive late, but it resonates powerfully once it's heard. No wall of lies can stand forever against the tide of truth. And as Thomas walked away, not into the past he reclaimed, but into the future, he redefined his silence, said more than revenge ever could, sometimes survival itself is the loudest verdict of all.